Hey fearsome friends. Regarding tonight's episode, I would like to give you a heads up on story 1 and warn you that there is talk of animal abuse. So if you want to skip, the timestamps are in the description. Also, I've noticed that 50% of my listeners haven't clicked that sub button, so could you please do so? It would help me a lot. These stories really are quite terrifying, so brace yourself. Now sit back, relax, get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. I've been needing to express myself about what happened since it happened in October 2017 to February 2019. I graduated from school in 2016 and wasn't working at this time. It wasn't like I hadn't tried to find work. I had. I just didn't get many calls back. I'd had a couple of job interviews, but they unfortunately all fell through. Plus it didn't help that I'd stupidly refused to put my resume forward to the local supermarkets, because most of the high school bullies worked at them, and the thought of working with the group of people who terrorized me for 4-ish years filled me with too much anxiety. So instead I spent most of the time surrounded with the select few friends that I had, which in the end wasn't that many at all. I was always kind of the quiet one at high school, and early on into school I got a girlfriend. I spent most of my time developing our relationship further instead of finding friends, which was a mistake I would come to regret when we split up right before high school ended. I didn't really have many friends to fall back on. But I did have one really close friend all throughout high school that we'll call Sam. Sam was really supportive when my girlfriend and I broke up. He had a great job, really nice family, money, friends, and at the time was a pretty good influence on me, as my parents would say. He didn't do any drugs or drink, and I looked up to him a lot. So considering all of that, it was a really easy decision when Sam asked me to move in with him when he'd found a cheap rental property. Sam's family were friends with a small real estate agent office, so it was easy for Sam to find a house, even if it was stupidly overpriced for the condition of it. But we were annoying, and our parents just wanted us out. Sam's family believed he was too successful for them to need their support, and my parents, well, my stepdad, wanted me out because he was tired of having to support me. Sam and I had his childhood friend move in with us too, who we'll call Blake. Now before we moved, I had never met this person before, and he was never really home because he was always out at work or dirt bike riding. He lived with us for about 4 months before the first big incident. So Sam had let 2 strangers, from Blake's perspective, sleep in his bed while he was away. And one night Blake got home around 2:30 a.m. and was getting ready for bed. And on walking into his room, he saw 2 teenagers having sex in his bed. He moved out the next day, and as far as I know, they haven't talked since. Fast forward to February 2018, and I had a source of income. I had gotten a job through my dad, and I was enjoying being out of the house. But by this time I was starting to suspect that something was really wrong with Sam. He now wasn't leaving to go to work before me, which was weird in itself, but he was becoming increasingly snappy and angry all of the time. Then he would leave for work early and didn't tell me where he was going, and in the end was cheating on his girlfriend with a girl from our high school. The first few months with my friend acting this way would be him threatening to move all my stuff out of the house and onto the road if I didn't do what he said, like cleaning up the house on my own, going shopping, or other various tasks. I didn't have much though, only my mattress, as he'd accidentally broken my bed frame while I was at work, and my office computer which I used for Discord and playing small indie games, so it wouldn't have been hard for him to actually do it. He never did though, but I guess it was because I never really argued with him. He then started stealing my clothes, which didn't even fit him, and would let me borrow his shirts to brag about how good of a friend he was. Eventually, too, he just stopped cooking food for himself. Sam's dad had given him a fuel card to use for petrol, which he used to buy fast food twice a day for months. That is until his dad cut him off from the card, at which time he turned to 2-litre bottles of iced coffee and McDonald's on a nightly basis. I understand that this was more of his business and not mine, but he eventually asked me to cover his part of the rent, and he couldn't afford bills, which then made it my issue. He started asking me to buy him food, and when I refused, he would guilt-trip me into feeling like absolute crap, or he would block the entrance to the house or the doorway to my room. I was already anxious since he had started getting more aggressive and angry, so I often agreed, which left me struggling financially. Eventually, he just stopped going to work, as he explained it. Work let me leave early today, and they said they would call me in again if they needed me. We got into an argument about it, as I called BS. It took him 10 weeks to call up his work, who explained to him that they'd only meant for that day, and that they had registered him as abandoning his job, so he was ultimately fired. I tried to support him as much as I could, as he did take me in when I was going through a breakup and had no income. But he got really mad and angry all the time, and would take it out on me. Then, because of all the free time he had, he began inviting the girl from high school over all the time, threatening me to keep it a secret from his girlfriend. Obviously, in the end I didn't, as I was close with Sam's current girlfriend, but I was actively trying to stay out of the house, so I only ever saw this girl over 2 or 3 times, as she was over all the time when I was at work, about 4 times a day in all. For the more tragic part of this story, he'd decided to get some pets. He was given a bird from his family, bought a dog which he called Sparta, and also got a cat from the girl from high school that he called Skittles, but it ran away. He got another cat to replace it and called that one Skittles as well. But the state that this kitten was left in on a regular basis was appalling. When either the girl or I wasn't at the house, we found out that he would lock the kitten in a closet and only feed her when he remembered. I should have tried harder to protect the animals in the house, and I tried my best to feed them when Sam wasn't around. But when he caught food missing, he would question me, and one time when he found me feeding his cat, he grabbed me, slammed me into the wall and screamed at me for poisoning his animals. Then he hit me, really hard. One day I came home, and the bird that was kept near the door wasn't there, and Sam wasn't home. I asked him where the bird was, and apparently it had fallen over in its cage and broken its neck. This where immediate panic set in, and I realized that I was living with someone who was much more than just depressed. Sam came home later, and I was ready to explode at him. I was fueled with rage and anger for what he had done to the bird, and with an empty shoebox, he proceeded to go to our backyard. I followed him, and it turned out that he had the box to bury the kitten, who, according to Sam, broke its neck jumping around in the closet. I remember the way he told me vividly. He wasn't sad or angry, but was empty. His eyes felt hollow, and he told me he wasn't sad about it. He then went back inside to his room and locked himself in, and I didn't see him for nearly a week. I came home one day from a very tiring day at work, so I had requested to get the morning off to clean for a house inspection. At this point, I believe, was our second inspection, so I stayed behind at work to do some overtime. Sam thought I was out for the night, and when I got home around 8:30, I found him and the girl from high school smoking weed in our living room. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. At this point, Sam wasn't the same person I went to high school with. Every day over the past 6 months, he had found every way to yell, steal, guilt, punch, kick, and threaten me nearly every day. He'd also blamed me for what happened to the bird and the cat, because I wasn't there to stop them from hurting themselves. This was one of the final turning points for me. I went to bed and had a sleepless night. I heard Sam insult me. I heard him cheat on his girlfriend. I heard him lie about money, being employed, and using everything he remembered from high school to impress her. The next day, I told his girlfriend, stole his dog, who was incredibly malnourished, even after I had been sneakily feeding him a handful of dry food twice a day, and had been beaten. I called the RSPCA and reported him for animal abuse. I emailed photos I'd taken of the house for proof, too. I used the cover of the real estate agent coming over for an inspection to protect myself from him overreacting. When I came back to collect the last of my things, which was my old PC, I stupidly entered the house thinking our real estate agent was in there. I thought his car was there, but it wasn't. I was greeted in the hallway by a shirtless Sam who pushed me against the wall. He smelt of weed and alcohol, and after pushing me against the wall with one hand, showed me a knife in the other, and he had pinned me up. There was a long argument, which was basically just him screaming at me and me shaking and not being able to spit my words out. He got even more angry when I told him where Sparta was, so he choked me and ran the silver of his knife down my arm. I remember feeling like I'd blacked out, as everything was a blur. He was getting more and more intense as he went on about how I'd betrayed him as a friend, and his girlfriend dumped him because of me. He eventually let go of my neck and pushed me harder into the wall with his shoulder. Then he drew the knife close to my neck. When at that point I truly felt like I was going to die. I muttered out, "My friends can hear you," as we were close enough to my room, and he often knew that when I left my room, I always had Discord open. He let go of me then, and I ran away to my car and left. I stayed with my parents for a couple of days after that, and slept on the couch, too afraid to really talk to anyone. My parents called me Jumpy, and I told them that I missed them, because I had hardly seen them over the past 10 or so months. Sam sent me a message, saying we needed to talk, which we did in a public place. He told me that he was moving out and back to his parents, because he could no longer support himself and the house. There were too many bad memories for him, so he left. To this day, I still haven't seen him. This was around August 2018, and people from high school stopped being his friends once the girl and I told all of our mutual friends what he'd done and how he'd behaved. I reported him to the police, but never pressed charges. I told them I never again wanted to see him, and I don't think anything ever came from it. I couldn't afford to get a restraining order either, as I recall being told they cost money. But I was happy I had at least reported it. I then moved back into the house on my own. He'd left all of his furniture and bedding as it was, only taking his headphones, his PS4 and his TV. From that moment on, I was alone and living in the house that my best friend nearly killed me in, and sleeping on his couch in the living room because I couldn't afford my own. I was alone, and I was in a really bad headspace. I stopped talking to all of my friends and work colleagues, and I started having nightmares. All of this was from October 2017 to August 2018, and I was still in the house until early 2019, which living in the aftermath of what Sam had done to me. It was actually as bad, if not worse, than living without him. The isolation and darkness and things I saw, plus the regret of not doing more for the animals in particular, still eats away at me. Things didn't get better either. That is, until I met a girl. So my dad and I live together in our own multi-family home in Germany, and my dad has a serious lung condition. His lungs produce and trap an excessive amount of mucus, and the trapped amount is huge and keeps his lungs from working correctly. So it's pretty normal that he has to be picked up by an ambulance every 2 to 3 weeks because he can't breathe. Last week it was that time of the month. He couldn't breathe, so I called an ambulance. He was brought to the closest hospital, which was normal for me, as this had happened at least 10 times in the last 6 months. So I went to bed after he'd been picked up, which was a Tuesday. I went to work the next morning and got a text from him that he had to stay for at least 2 more days, until around Friday. So Wednesday evening I got home from work and played a match of Rogue Company, when suddenly the doorbell rang. Weird, I thought. We never have unannounced visitors. I walked over to the door and was about to press the door buzzer to open the main door when I heard more than one voice directly in front of my door. So that someone had just gotten past the main door. Strange. I asked who it was, but there was silence for around 3 seconds. Then a person who sounded like my father, but at the same time didn't, suddenly says, "Micha, it's me. I forgot my keys. Open the door." I thought, okay, in that case. Wait a minute. My dad never calls me Micha, only Michi, and there was a sarcastic tone in the voice from behind the door. I didn't trust this situation, so called my father on his phone. If the person in front of my door was my father, his phone would ring. It didn't. My father answered, and as I suspected, he was still in the hospital. Meanwhile, the 2 people on the other side of the door heard my phone call and started kicking my door in. "Let me in, Micha. It's your daddy. Let me in." Thank God that door is reinforced. After I threatened them with calling the police and having a big-ass knife in my hand, they left. I heard their footsteps running down the staircase, and I rushed to a window that faces the street to check if I could see a car or a license plate. But nothing. Just a few footsteps in the distance. They thankfully never came back. But what was weird was that they knew my name and that my father wasn't home, despite his car being in the driveway. My buddy reported something similar happening to him, so we called the police, and an investigation is in progress. So several years ago, I attended a screenplay writing convention. It was located at a resort on a lake. The perfect place, I thought, for me to hone my writing skills and maybe make a few friends along the way. I met John on my first day at the convention. He came up to me while the attendees were slowly filtering into the auditorium and wanted to know what I'd written and whether I'd ever finished a screenplay and if I knew who Dostoevsky was. He seemed a little shy, and all the other attendees seemed to already belong to established cliques, so I decided to play the hero, which is really a good idea, and be his friend. I knew all about Dostoevsky, as Crime and Punishment is one of my favorite books, and I had actually brought it with me to the convention. I had written 3 books, not screenplays, that were published, so we had plenty to talk about. I gave him my business card with my professional website and email and told him I'd see him around. We ended up in different small groups that met on opposite sides of the resort, but somehow John always seemed to appear near my conference room. He'd gotten lost, perhaps, or he left his computer in the hallway right outside. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I figured he was probably just lonely. I had gone through that as a kid. A few days into the convention, not go out on a date. No, he actually meant go out, as in be his girlfriend. Taken aback at the speed with which he made that decision, I told him I had a boyfriend and thought that would be the end of it. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. I soon noticed that I had a John-shaped shadow that followed me everywhere I went. When I was in the restaurant, he would linger outside, his eyes fixed on me. When I was walking around the park, he'd sit on the bench in the middle, staring at me. When my seminars went long, he'd be outside waiting for me. Then he'd leave right before I came out. He had dark brown, almost black eyes that looked like holes in his face, and I saw those damned eyes reflected off the windows everywhere I went. One day the resort held a party for its guests. I lied and told him I was sick and wasn't going. He told me he wasn't going either. But I went anyway, and when I got there, I saw him sitting on a bench scanning the crowd. The moment he saw me, his whole face changed. You might expect that he would just be surprised to see me, but he didn't look surprised at all. In fact, he looked like he knew I was going to be there, and he looked pissed. When I walked away from my friends to raid the buffet, he approached me. "I thought you said you weren't coming." "I changed my mind," I told him. But I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe me, and my answer hadn't appeased his anger at all. The next day I decided to see if he really was following me, or if it was all in my imagination. I told him I was going back to my cabin, which he didn't know where it was, and I knew that he was staying on the opposite side of the resort and had no reason to follow me, so I set off down the road without looking back. When I got inside, I slipped on a quick but professional disguise. Glasses instead of contacts, a ball cap and a different outfit. With my waist-length hair tucked under the hat, I thought I could at least buy myself a few seconds of anonymity. Confident in my new identity, I stepped outside and looked around. The cabins were arranged in a circle, and were bordered on all sides by woods and bushes. Anyone who had a legitimate reason to come to the cabin would be on the road or in the clearing between the cabins. Anyone who didn't have a legitimate reason to come to the cabin would probably come through the woods. I spied an anomalous object amongst the trees and adjusted my glasses. There, peeking out from behind a bush, was dear old John. He almost recognized me, but he hesitated just long enough for me to slip away. Believe it or not, all this happened in one single week, and as I was leaving the convention, I decided that I wouldn't answer any more of his texts, as I was starting to get a little nervous about the extent of his obsession. He must have figured I would do that, because less than 24 hours after my ignoring campaign began, he texted me that I had driven him to suicide, and when he died I would have to live with the knowledge that it was all my fault. If I had been friendlier, if I had been nicer, if I had responded faster to his messages, if I had told him more about myself. I told him to call 911 if he was having a mental health crisis, warned the resort security about him, and blocked his number. Fast forward a few weeks. Remember that innocent little business card I'd given John? Well, somehow from that meager bit of information, he'd managed to contact me on Instagram, Twitter, my website, my email, Hangouts and text, again with a new phone number. Each time the message was either, "I'm so sorry, will you take me back?" or "If you call the cops, I will make you regret it," or "Don't you feel bad that I almost killed myself because of you?" Each time I blocked him. A year into the seemingly endless fiasco, I thought I'd finally gotten rid of him. That is, until I received an email asking me to review a screenplay. That's nothing unusual. I do reviews and critiques all the time, and I was more than happy to review this one. It was poorly written, and the style was a bizarre mix of dark and nonsensical. But I worked my way through it, as thoroughly as I could, and sent it back to the young aspiring author who'd asked for my help. A few days later, I received a message from Carlos, confessing that it was really John all along. Blocked again. Ugh, what a pain. 6 months later, once again I thought I was safe, and I went about my business, doing critiques as usual, until I received a DM from a young lady who admired my work and wanted to know if I could recommend her book. The style of the message and the suddenness of the request made me suspicious. Using Google Analytics embedded into a page on my website, I grabbed the sender's location. And what do you know? They came from the same location as John. Now, because I'm a nerd, I calculated the odds of that happening by accident. They were about 1 in 1,000. Fishy. That, as far as I know, was the last I've ever heard of John. This happened a few years ago when I was going through a difficult time. I was looking for a new place to live temporarily, whilst I figured my life out. I was looking through Craigslist one day, in search for a place, and I found this guy who said he had an apartment and was looking for a roommate. I got his name and number, called him and set up a meeting in a public place. Everything went seemingly fine, and he agreed to show me around. He seemed really nice and helpful, and was easy to get along with. The place was neat and low maintenance, and it didn't bother me that he was a guy. We agreed on no drugs, no parties, and a no craziness term. And we also agreed on monthly payments, and I moved in a few weeks later. One day, around 2 weeks after moving in, he came in early from work and sounded really upset. He said, "We need to talk," and went on to say that I've been acting inappropriately by having my boyfriend visit on occasion, not even stay or spend the night or anything like that, and said he could only see me for like 10 minutes every now and then. I began asking him what he was talking about, and he just said that it made him feel uncomfortable because everyone at the apartment complex thought that I was his romantic partner. I was so furious and couldn't believe it. But it got worse. It escalated to a point where he said that the entire time he had known me, which was for about 2 weeks of very minimal interaction, plus the fact that I worked night shifts, so he was by himself most of the time when he was home. He was convinced that I was possessed. His exact words were, "I believe you are possessed. I can see it in your eyes." I knew at this point that it had totally hit the fan, and that I needed to get as far away from this weirdo as I could. He then acted all calm and said that I could take my time looking for a new place, and that our arrangement in the future would not work. Yeah, like hell it will. So I told my boyfriend what had happened, and found an apartment I could move into the next day, and let the insane roommate know. The next day of my moving came, and I walked into the apartment to get my stuff. There was actually a wooden cross above my room's doorframe, with this cliché Jesus on it, which was pretty offensive, since I am Christian, and this lunatic had decided that I was possessed. Then upon entering my room, there were creepy candles lit everywhere. I packed up all my belongings as quickly as possible, and got the hell out of there. He sent me a message later, of course along the lines of God, and how he was hoping I would face my sins and darkness. So I blocked this creep's number immediately. I trust people a lot less now, and would never have a roommate again. And this was the first time ever in my life that I had one. All for only 2 weeks. This took place in August of 2018. I own a large grain and cattle farm, and I have quite a few workers and family that work for me. On this particular day, I was the only one there, and my dad's truck was there as he was inside the shop working on some stuff. It was a pretty slow day. I was outside in a small patch of grass that we had to park equipment on, so I was between the road and the shop. I had just finished working on our baler, when I stood up and noticed out of the corner of my eye a black Chevy Escalade parked in the driveway. At first I didn't think anything of it, because we get lots of people who will pull in to turn around. So as I was organizing my tools to go back into the shop, the guy suddenly appeared behind me. Not literally, but it felt like it. So I asked, "Can I help you with something?" Yeah, the latch won't shut on my trunk. Can you come over here?" I didn't really want to, but I said yes and walked over. The guy kept trying to walk behind me, like he didn't want to be seen. So I got there, and I saw that the trunk was latched shut. So I said, "I don't see where it's broken." "Right there," he said, and vaguely pointed to his trunk. "Right where?" I asked. At this point I was getting a really weird vibe from this guy, so stood up and said, "I can't fix it, so you may as well leave." He then started walking over to the driver's door, and when he opened it, he was reaching for something under the seat. I started reaching for my gun just in case. Then he stopped and gave me this "I'm not done with you" look. So I returned the look right back to him and he left. I told my dad and we laughed about it, and later I told my wife and brothers. A few days later, I was getting ready to go to bed, and the news happened to be on, when something they said caught my attention. They'd found a black Chevy Escalade in a ditch with 4 bodies in the trunk. Apparently the guy had killed his family and the neighbors, then killed himself after trying to ram someone off the road. Let's just say I was pretty shocked. So yeah, that's how I avoided death that day. I just read one post here about a creepy guy harassing a girl, and it reminded me of something that happened to me last week. During my lunch hour, I, a 26-year-old female, decided to take a walk. I'm currently working from home, so I know there's a small park near me that has a large circular walking path along the edge of it, which I thought would be perfect. This park is not very big, with just a basketball court, a field and a small playground, and it's easy to see the entire area from any point inside or outside of it. The only thing that obscures it, though, is a very small copse of trees, maybe 6 to 7 pines, that are clustered at one corner. During my walk, I happened to be on the phone with my parents, so I was initially less alert than I should have been. But I did notice a lump of blankets behind the park sign that seemed to be the outline of a homeless person sleeping. Realizing someone was trying to rest, I moved quickly so I wouldn't disturb them and began walking the path around the park. After I'd walked about 1/3 of the path, I looked back and saw the pile of blankets was empty. Also, there was a large man in a bright red shirt who was staring at me from across the way. I'm not sure if this man was the one who was sleeping in the blankets or not, but looking at him made me feel uncomfortable. As I continued down the path, the guy in the bright red shirt came up the same path, going the opposite way, so he was now coming towards me. I began to worry he was coming to interact with me, but he stepped off the path near the small group of trees at the edge of the park. Initially I relaxed, thinking he had taken a shortcut through the trees to go to the apartment complex on the other side, and I was half laughing at myself and my paranoia, when I realized he hadn't finished going through the trees, and was hiding behind the 2 trees closest to the path that I was walking towards. I don't know how he thought I couldn't see him, as his shoes were sticking out, and he was wearing a bright red shirt. I waited for a moment to see if he was peeing or something, but he just stood there, facing the path, waiting. I turned and cut through the center of the park to go home immediately, and as I waited for the light to turn, so I could cross the street, I looked back and saw he had left the trees and was walking quickly towards me. Before the light turned green, I looked him in the eyes as I grabbed my pocket knife, then I crossed the street. After I'd crossed, I looked back and couldn't find him. I don't know where he'd gone, but I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way home. In 2017, during my last semester of high school, Some friends and I decided to skip the pep rally for the girls' varsity basketball team. My last period of the day was theatre tech. I was just taking it as a fine arts credit, and 2 of my friends in the grade below me were in that class with me. So after we'd decided to skip the rally, we left school early and went to the nearby Taco Bell, like we did every day. However, administrators and security guards patrolled the parking lots to catch kids trying to skip, so we took a detour through the nature trail on campus in order to avoid them. Once on the trail, we came across this kid I hadn't seen before. He was a skinny white kid, with shaggy black hair, and was wearing baggy jeans and a plain white t-shirt. He was shorter than me, but the most notable thing about him was his general look of dishevelment. His hair was wild and full of leaves and twigs. His plain white t-shirt was dirty, and the knees of his jeans were stained green and brown. It seemed like he had been crawling around in the dirt, and I remember wondering for a split second if he was actually living there. When we stumbled upon him, we were walking in one direction, parallel to the school and to the back of the parking lot, and he was coming directly towards us. I knew this nature trail well enough to know there was a bend that led deeper into the woods, so I figured he had come from there. He was out of breath, and he looked scared. My 2 friends said hi to him. My friends were in the grade below me, and later told me that the kid was in their grade, and they recognized him. It was supposed to be just a quick hello, but I couldn't help but notice how scared he looked, and how suspicious he seemed of us. He asked us what we were doing in the woods, and we told him we were skipping the pep rally. Then one of my friends asked, "What have you been doing out here? Camping?" Me and my other friend gave a nervous laugh, but the kid didn't crack a smile. He explained that he was dropped off at school that morning and was supposed to get on a bus to take him to DAEP. DAEP was the alternative school that kids who got suspended went to. His plain outfit started to make sense now. It was the infamous uniform of the alternative school. He then explained that he didn't want to go, so when his mum dropped him off, he pretended like he would wait for the bus, then hide in the nature trail for the full 8 hours of the school day. He was still acting really skittish though, and without even looking at each other or speaking to each other, my friends and I could feel that something wasn't right, and that we were in some kind of danger. The kid looked around nervously often, as if seeing if someone might have followed us, or if we were alone in the woods. We hit him with a, "All right, man, well, good luck. We're going to go and try get to our cars and get home before the pep rally ends." When he heard the word cars, he then perked up. He started walking with us towards the parking lot and continued to talk. He suddenly became a lot more friendly and asked if we would give him a ride home. We gave him some half-baked excuse as to why we couldn't. We didn't expect him to ask, and I've never met him before, and my friends barely knew him, but he didn't take no for an answer. He told us that people were going to start looking for him pretty soon, and that he was going to be in a lot of trouble. We told him that he'd probably be fine hiding there that deep in the nature trail, but he told us, "No man, you don't understand. I broke into a car at the fellowship, and pointed in the direction of the megachurch that had a parking lot that backed up to my school. I took this," he said, pulling out a handgun from his waistband. I felt sick to my stomach, as I had never seen a gun in real life. At this point, I really felt in danger. Not just because he had produced a gun. I had never really been scared of them. But more so that the entire interaction felt uneasy, and that the guy was already unsettling and desperate. One of my friends very cautiously told him that he should probably just ditch it and take off somewhere. But he just stood there staring at us for an uncomfortable amount of time. His eyes were meeting each of ours, so I broke the silence by saying that we wouldn't tell anyone, but that we really had to go before the pep rally ended. Then my other stupid-ass friend, who had been virtually silent the entire time, spoke up and said, "Yeah, and it's best we're not around if they start looking for you for that." gesturing to the handgun. His eyes narrowed, and once more he asked if one of us could take him home. And this time it felt more like a command. I've never been a very brave person, but in that moment, I don't know why, I just blurted out, "Nah man, I'm good." And again there was an uncomfortable silence. Then he asked, "Before you leave, do you guys want to see something?" My first friend was kind of a hothead, and although he was uncomfortable with the situation, he wasn't afraid of conflict. Nor was I. But my other friend was not a fan of conflict and would always be the first to de-escalate any potential dangerous situation. We all looked at each other, and me and my first friend kind of had an unspoken understanding, like, if this is going to happen, we have to run or fight. We might have to do it now. My other friend was very visibly afraid and asked, "What do you want to show us?" Before the kid could answer, my first friend said, "We don't want to see. We have to go." My first friend then started briskly walking past the kid, and me and the other friend quickly followed. Within a few steps, we just started sprinting towards the parking lot. I looked back once more, and we were about 50 steps away, and he was still standing there watching us run. He had put the gun back in his waistband before taking a small adjacent trail back deeper into the woods. By the time we made it to the parking lot, there were police everywhere. We were sweating, out of breath and terrified. They found the kid in the next 10 minutes, and somehow in the chaos, nobody had seen us exit the trail and into the parking lot. But since there were so many cops there, we decided to just head back inside through another side door, only to find it locked. That's when an administrator found us, brought us inside, and shoved us into a classroom where we were able to talk with others and find out what was going on. And this is what we could piece together from what we'd learned. It turned out that the kid had skipped DAEP, hidden in the nature trail, broken into a car at the church, and stolen a semi-automatic shotgun and a handgun from inside it. After stealing the guns, he'd texted his girlfriend and told her that he was about to do something really terrible and that when she saw his name on the news, she should turn off the TV. He told her explicitly that he was going to kill the kids at school. She knew he was supposed to be in DAEP and was worried about the text, so she contacted the police. DAEP went on lockdown, then until officers got a call from a guy at the church that 2 guns had been stolen from his car behind the school, they put 2 and 2 together and caught him hiding in the woods. I guess when he saw me and my 2 friends in the trail, he quickly hid the shotgun, but didn't have time to hide the pistol, or didn't care enough to hide it. I'm new to sharing my weird happenings, but this is so recent that it still has me reeling. I want to scream, but I guess typing will just have to do for now. Sometime in late 2019, I started seeing someone. We'll call him Shu. Shu seemed nice enough, and was generally what appeared to be a somewhat normal guy. He kept insisting we move in together though, despite dating for only a few months, and the fact that I already owned a house. That should have been enough to tell me to run, but of course I didn't. Then Shu started showing up at my house late at night, without announcing himself or asking to be invited. At first it wasn't too bad, but it became a nightly occurrence. Then he started lying for attention, even going so far as to claim a close friend had died. No, a close friend hadn't died. He'd show up drunk and demanding my attention and refuse to follow my house rules. If I did let him in, he'd refuse to leave. So long story short, Shu's behaviour kept getting worse and worse, showing up drunk from being at the bars all night during COVID and demanding my attention despite knowing that I'm high risk. One night he tried one last time to get into my home, and that's when I cut it off right there and told him to leave me alone. The next morning I got a call at 5 a.m. asking me to come into work on my day off. I was annoyed but agreed. Then the calls started, non-stop. I'd tell him to leave me alone and hang up again and again. When it was time to leave for work, I assumed it was my boss calling to tell me he was here to pick me up. But it wasn't. It was Shu. 7 a.m. and he was camped out on my porch, trying to grab me in broad daylight in front of my boss. This kind of behavior went on for nearly a week, and my employees refused to let me walk home after he'd then started showing up at my place of work at closing time and would try to cut me off when trying to get into my house. I found out he'd kept calling because he could hear my phone ringing through the thin walls of my old home and was trying to locate exactly where I was. Every day I'd have upwards of 20 phone calls and 50 text messages. When I finally called the police after he'd threatened that I was too poor for a restraining order, the cop drew the line right there and took it as a direct threat to my well-being. When I got home that day, I noticed cigarette ash all over my porch and a hole burnt into my patio chair. Soon after, I found a window in the basement forced open with a surgical mask on the floor. I told my roommate and my neighbours what had been going on and gave a description of Shu and to be on the lookout. Things quietened down, and after a few months the phone calls from the VPNs had finally stopped. I was in the car with my housemate earlier this week, and I mentioned a smudge on the garage door. He parks in front of the garage, not in it, when he told me, "Yeah, I think a homeless guy was squatting in there for a while, probably weeks. I found a bunch of clothes in there, and then they disappeared a couple of weeks ago." My heart dropped into my stomach. I noticed tracks in the snow, too big for my housemate to have left, but thought, no way, it couldn't be. I was shoveling snow all through the night for my neighbours all winter, and he was literally within an arm's reach of me, able to see directly into the windows of my house. And yes, I scolded my housemate. I get that he's a guy and doesn't really get it when a woman says, "He's dangerous, call the cops if anything weird happens around the house." But come on, man. Now this may not be the creepiest to some, but to me it stands out amongst the many negative experiences I've had in my life when it comes to strangers. To start off, I want to say that I believe a certain type of people have a strong magnet for attracting the wicked and evil out there. They are drawn to your light, innocence, naivety, and can spot you a mile away. I am much older now, but when I was younger, I attracted a lot of the sort. I once was sexually assaulted, escaped and got away before being fully raped. But this story is not about that, and this one came after that encounter a few years later. It wasn't invasive as physically as the assault, but invasive much more deeply in the sense that I could feel the extreme dark energy surrounding it. It started one normal day in my early 20s, when I got picked up by my then boyfriend, future husband, as we had to go drop his daughter off at her cheer gym and made plans to spend the rest of the day together. After we dropped her off and run a few errands, we decided it would be a good idea to grab lunch somewhere. As we were driving along, we came across a small country restaurant that we'd never been to before, so decided to give it a try. Walking through the entrance, we walked straight up to the counter to take a look at the menus and start trying to figure out what we wanted to order. I quickly make my decision and told the cashier, whilst my boyfriend was indecisive and started chatting with the cashier about the food. I became distracted and started looking around the small place, trying to decide where we would sit to eat our meal, when I noticed that the place was completely empty, besides the staff behind the counter and us up in the front. My eyes were sweeping the small room. I felt an uneasiness all of a sudden, and I didn't know why. It was so strong, too. While I was trying to figure out what was causing it, my boyfriend called to me and I turned to him, giving back all my attention. He said, "Come on, let's go sit down. They'll call our number when our food is ready." We walked over to a booth, sat down, started talking about our day, and I had forgotten about the uneasiness I'd felt earlier. Then my boyfriend got an important work call that he had to take. I was okay and just sat waiting patiently for him to be done, and just texted a friend, hoping the food would be coming out soon. It was then that the feeling of easiness returned, again trying to figure out where it was coming from. My eyes then quickly swept the room, and I immediately realized he was staring at me with his big speckled glasses, staring straight at me, and he had a blank expression on his face. It was a man I'd never seen before. He was sitting several booths back, and I'd somehow missed him when we'd first come in. I thought there were no other diners at the time, but I was obviously wrong. I quickly looked away and positioned myself where my boyfriend's head covered up his line of view of me, and I started to question if this man had been staring at me the whole time since we'd walked in. Maybe not. Maybe our eyes just met accidentally at the same time when I first noticed him. I decided to test it and peeked out behind my boyfriend's head, and he was still staring at me. Now I noticed, though, that he had a half-empty plate in front of him. I quickly hid back behind my boyfriend's head and started wondering if maybe I was imagining it. I thought maybe he was looking at something behind me. I then guessed there was a TV behind me on the wall, and that was what he was actually looking at. I kept all these thoughts to myself, because I didn't want to assume or make judgment of someone who may just be innocently sitting there having a meal. However, at the same time, I did feel very uneasy, and the feeling was heavy in my gut. I peeked out more from there once more, and saw his stare had not stopped or changed. My boyfriend was still on the phone, but had started to notice that I seemed antsy and uncomfortable. He showed a face of concern as I lowered my head and refused to look up towards behind him. He mouthed to me that he was almost done with his call, and once he was, he quickly hung up and asked if I was okay and why I was hiding my head. I said to him, "Don't look now, but ever since we sat down, that man has been staring at me non-stop. I think he was even staring at me when we first walked in, but I didn't notice him sitting down in the back there." I then asked my boyfriend if there was a TV behind me up on the wall, and he said, "No, there's nothing." I quickly took a look behind me, and there was nothing, just a wall. No door, poster, or wall decor, nothing at all. I realized that there was nothing behind me the man could possibly be staring at non-stop. Just then our number was called to come get our food up at the counter. My boyfriend started to get up, and I told him no, and that I would go get the food. Then I would know if the man really was staring at me or not. So I got up, walked over to the counter, grabbed the food tray, and started to feel chills down my back. I turned around to see he was staring straight at me. It was almost like he was looking through me. I felt like he wasn't looking at me like a person, though. He didn't frown or raise his eyebrows. It was just a blank, dead stare. I quickly hurried to my booth, as his eyes followed me back all the way, and I felt like I was being stalked by his gaze alone. Once I got back to the booth, I wasn't even in the mood to eat. I told my boyfriend that I was certain the man was staring at me, and for him to finish his meal quickly, because I wanted to leave. My boyfriend, wanting to comfort me and upset himself, turned around, threw his hands up in the air and shot him a dirty look. However, even though he did that, the man didn't stop staring. He just kept staring at me and didn't even seem to acknowledge or care that my boyfriend was aware of what he was doing. We'd finally had enough, and decided to throw our food into a to-go box and leave, all the while his stare following me out the door. We even checked to make sure he hadn't followed us out to our car. That experience has always stayed with me, It was just a stare, but the feeling that came with it was pure dread. I think that what got to me mostly, though, as a person who had history of being preyed upon by pedos, I felt more negative energy from that man's stare, like he was something much worse. I think after you go through some traumatic things, your senses are more in tune to pick up on bad energies, and you can sense danger more strongly. If you get a bad gut feeling around a place or person, listen to it. I'm a guy, and this was probably 9 or 10 years ago. I was in my mid-30s and out of town with some co-workers at an IT conference for the week. It was a nice town as they go. Well, the main street was anyway. One night, one of the companies sponsoring the conference had an open bar night at a club there. You can see where this is going. So of course I drank too much, and after the rest of my co-workers had left to go back to the hotel, I stayed and kept drinking. The bar finally closed, and on my way back, someone else from the conference decided to take it on himself to make sure I got back to the hotel safely. I didn't want them to, and quite frankly was an ass to him about it. When we got back to my hotel, I decided what I really needed was a cigarette. So when the guy left, I went to a different exit to find a store that was open at 2 a.m. to get a pack of smokes. Back then I used to smoke when I was drinking, but not anymore. I walked up and down the main street trying to find a place that was open, but couldn't. I then ran into a couple that I assumed were locals, and asked them if they knew of any store that was open at this hour. They said, "Sure, follow us," and they started leading me off the main street. After a couple of blocks, my drunken brain started to realize we were quickly getting into a dangerous rundown part of town, so I started asking how far it was. "Oh, it's right over here," they kept saying. Then we got to this construction site, and I was now really scared. "It's right down here," they said. I looked where they were pointing, and it was a dark alleyway. No way. I said, "Okay, I'm right behind you." Then I bolted in the other direction at full sprint. I rounded a corner, slipped on some gravel and wiped out. I tore multiple holes in my jeans, and my palm was full of gravel and bleeding. I hid behind a dumpster for a few minutes, and heard them walking back and talking to each other, but I couldn't tell what they were saying. When I couldn't hear them anymore, I ran back to the main street, because it was still well lit, and my hotel was several blocks down, so that was my lifeline to safety. On my way back, I could hear them the next block or two over, shouting, "Where did that guy go?" And I started hearing additional voices with them, and I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they were unquestionably talking to the original two. I hurried to the hotel and got to my room, and quickly passed out still drunk, but had sobered a bit from the adrenaline. I'm quite sure I narrowly avoided getting robbed, or worse, in that dark alley, and they had been looking for me for a while after I'd run off. The guy that tried to get me safely back to my hotel deserved some props, and an apology from me for bugging out on him like I did. Unfortunately, though, I didn't see him for the rest of the conference, but I probably would have been too embarrassed to say anything to him anyway. Years ago, when I lived in a small milling town with my then boyfriend, a crackhead used to come regularly to my door. We lived in a small old mill house that was about $400 a month, which was a good deal for being right outside a fairly large city, after just moving out of my parents' house. However, there were some consequences that came with living in such an affordable home. The local crackhead that would always go door to door asking for handouts, to name one. She was a middle-aged lady who was clearly on some serious drugs, and never took no for an answer. My first encounter with her was not a direct one. I was in the shower when I heard my pit bull aggressively barking, which she never does, so I called out to my boyfriend, but got no answer. I quickly finished washing my hair out and got out of the shower to find out what was going on. As I walked out to the living room, I found my dog. It was whimpering and staring out through our front door. It was glass, as well as my boyfriend's shotgun leaning up against the wall. Odd. I freaked out a little bit because boyfriend's car was gone too. I tried calling him, but heard his phone ringing on the couch. At this point, I wasn't sure if I should call the cops or wait, as my ex was an asshole and would probably scold me for worrying if there was, in fact, nothing wrong. After about 10 minutes of anxiously considering my options, my dumbass boyfriend pulled back into our driveway with a woman in his front seat. He eventually came in and explained that she'd come to the door asking for a ride to the gas station to get kerosene for her heater. I didn't understand why he'd brought his gun out to answer the door, but I wasn't going to ask any more questions. After this, she would constantly come to our door asking for different things like cigarettes, beer, and more rides to different places, and my ex would always oblige. One night she came to the door asking for alcohol, I believe, but we didn't have any to give, so she asked my ex for $5. He gave her the money and came back inside, and this was my breaking point. I told him that I didn't feel comfortable with her coming to the door like that, and that we had to stop giving her things. I would normally be more than happy to help someone out, but for her to come to the door every other day was becoming too much. I told him that every time he wasn't home, she would continuously bang on the door for around 10 minutes, and when I don't answer, she'd yell out vulgar comments about me, then storm off. He said that he didn't want to say no, and didn't know how to get rid of her. Then one night my ex wasn't home, and I had a work friend over for dinner and drinks. At around 10 p.m, I got that regular knock at the door. It was the Crackhead. She asked me for a ride, and I told her I had guests over and couldn't. She then proceeded to put her hand against my door, as if to hold it open, and asked me where the man was, my ex. I told her he wasn't home, when my girlfriend walked over to make sure I was okay. The Crackhead told us that she needed to go to McDonald's because she's a diabetic and her doctor said that she needed to be on a special diet of hamburgers. Now my friend, who's in the medical field, told her that that doesn't seem sound. Angrily, the Crackhead said they make her special hamburgers, so completely over it at this point, I began to shut the door, but she pushed back. "Well, can I have a beer?" she asked. I shot her a dirty look for trying to fight back on shutting my door, told her no, and with the help of my friend we finally got the door shut as she screamed, "What about a cigarette?" She sat outside my house yelling until she eventually walked away. I told my ex about the incident, and we finally agreed not to answer any more. So this was just a few weeks ago, when my friend and I took up the hobby of exploring abandoned buildings and urban exploration in our free time, as we just found it to be really fun and interesting. We're from Long Island, New York, where MS-13, the deadliest street gang in America, mainly operate out of some of the towns in the area. One day I was browsing around the internet for nearby places to explore, when I came across the Pilgrim State Psychiatric Center in Brentwood, New York. We didn't put much thought into it, as we were eager to get there, so we just went. We parked up in a lot from a good distance away, and began our walk through the woods to get there. We had already done this many times, and I had never had this strange feeling before. Just the walk over to it made me feel uneasy, like I've never felt before. There was trash everywhere, and dirt mounds that seemed like they could have been dug up. We finally came to the building, which was conveniently easy to enter. And once we were in, we were greeted by dirty mattresses, that seemed to have been placed there purposely. We didn't talk to each other about how we felt in that moment, because we didn't want to seem like wimps. We went through the entire building, seeing many mattresses and old shoes on the way, when we eventually made it to the top. And by that time it had gotten dark out, and we had a long walk back. We made our way back down the building, and got lost on the way, but the only way we could go at that point was across this plank that was resting across a massive drop. But that's not the bad part. We found a window, and were able to crawl out and start walking back along the road to get to my car. We came across 2 cops, who stopped and talked to us. "You really shouldn't be going in there after dark," they said. Then they let us go on our way. We laughed it off as we got into the car, and later on my friend called his cousin up to tell him about where we'd been. His cousin then told us that MS-13 operated out of there, and that we were lucky to be alive. I looked up Pilgrim State murder, and as sure as hell, I see that multiple teens had been murdered there and in the woods where we walked. Cops had been digging and searching the woods recently, looking for some missing teenagers, so I connected the dots between that and the mounds I'd seen. I went to bed that night shaking at the thought of being so close to death for entering their territory. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.